Hi, everyone. Welcome to our program today. We're going to get started here with Remembering the Raisin. Let me get my screen share operation going here. There we go. Our program today is entitled Remembering the Raisin, the War of 1812, the Battle of the River Raisin, and the Pendleton County men who fought there. Just something to keep in mind as we go through. The War of 1812 was also known as the Second War for Independence, and the Battle of the River Raisin was also known as the Battle of Frenchtown. The Battle of Frenchtown, or the River Raisin, took place from the 18th of January through the 23rd of January. It wasn't a continuous battle the entire time. The 18th was really more of a skirmish. A battle actually broke out on the 22nd and a massacre occurred on the 23rd, and we'll look at all of that as we go on. So first of all, I'm going to start with some background info on the War of 1812, because if you're like me, I don't remember much about it from school days. And so I thought maybe a little refresher might be kind of at hand. We're going to look at what caused the War of 1812. Why were Kentuckians involved in this war? And where did our men from Pendleton County fight? To put it in perspective, historical perspective for you, I am having trouble talking today, so please forgive me. It's like, you know, words just don't come out right. James Madison was the president. He was the 4th president of the United States, so we're still a very young country at that time. The war actually was declared on the 18th of June, 1812, and ended on February 18, 1815. The conflict stemmed primarily from unfinished business left over from the American Revolution and pressures that were growing as a result of Great Britain struggling with France. There was a little conflict going on there. There were 4 main causes of the war. One was the impressment of U.S. sailors, interference with American shipping, American expansionism, and of course, war hawks, or those who wanted to fight, who were always eager for a fight. The impressment of sailors was a practice in Great Britain's Royal Navy. They had a high rate of desertion in their Navy, probably because of working conditions and just that they were very strict disciplinarians. So it was nothing for their soldiers to go AWOL, as we would call it today. And they would sometimes sign on with American merchant ships after doing that. So the British would stop these merchant ships, go on board and look for their men and then take them off. This was it's often cited as a cause of the war, but in reality, it was not seen as that big of a deal for the most part. And it had been going on, you know, in the early 1800s, the first decade. So it was nothing really new. Interference with American shipping. This stemmed from the problems between France and Great Britain. And it began in 1806 with France, who prohibited all neutral trade with Great Britain. And of course, America was trying to stay neutral in this conflict. So we were affected, our trade was affected. In 1807, Great Britain then banned all trade between France, the allies of France, and the Americas. So now we can't get into France to do any trading, and we can't go to Great Britain to trade. There were blockades, and there were efforts made to stop trade getting into those countries. So Congress, in retaliation, passed a series of acts. We started off with an embargo act in 1807, and then the non-intercourse acts came along later. None of this was effective. And so in 1810, the United States reopened trade with both countries, provided that they stopped their blockades against neutral trading. France complied, but Great Britain continued to stop American merchant ships to search for their deserters and to enforce their blockade. So James Madison made this an issue. He said that, you know, any flag flying under the United States, or any ship sailing under the American flag could not be treated this way. And this was a matter of national sovereignty to him. Eventually, the British can stop this practice, but Madison continued to complain about it. And he asked Congress for a declaration of war on Great Britain on the first day of June, 1812. Many who supported the call to arms saw the British and Spanish territory in North America as potential prizes, something that could be won as a spoil of war, either during the war or in negotiations as a spoil of war, which leads us to the American expansionism, which was an underlying cause of the war. We had, since President Jefferson, the Americas have been moving westward and pushing into the Native American lands. And this had caused at least two nations of Native Americans, the Algonquian and the Iroquoian nations of the Great Lakes and the Ohio country, to organize against the United States, and they were supplied weapons by British traders who were in Canada. It was in Britain's best interest to prevent further growth in America, or it was seen as such. Kentucky did not have a federal fort within its boundaries at that time, so manpower was not tied up defending them. This enabled Kentuckians to enlist larger numbers in the effort in this particular theater, where we live. And by having larger numbers, we also had larger casualties of war and actually Kentucky's casualties were larger than every other state put together. So we suffered greatly in this conflict. Pendleton County men fought at the River Raisin, Fort Meigs, and the Thames River en masse. I have found some men who were in Indiana fighting in 1812. I have not found any who fought in New Orleans. That doesn't mean they didn't. It just means I haven't found them. Kentucky sent something like 25,000 men to fight in this war, which totaled out to be 5 out of 6 men military age. So that was a large number of men gone from the home front during this time. Kentucky sent 36 regiments, 4 battalions, 12 independent companies to the field, which was considered almost an unbelievable accomplishment because our population in the state was so small at that time. Kentuckians from all over the state served in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Louisiana, and in Ontario, Canada. And if you're like me and you like a little bit of trivia, I've got some for you. Kentucky helped not only fight the war, but supply the war. A major supply depot for the war was built at Newport, and it was called the Newport Barracks. The Newport Barracks served as a staging area, and later on, it was a supply depot for the Mexican War in 1844. It also housed prisoners of war and political prisoners, I guess you would say, people arrested as Southern sympathizers during the Civil War. Saltpeter was heavily mined in Kentucky, with Carter County and Rockcastle County being significant suppliers of saltpeter. But the most notable mining took place at Mammoth Cave. Saltpeter there was considered exceptional quality, and they mined 575,000 pounds during the War of 1812 from Mammoth Cave. Saltpeter was used in the manufacture of explosives. The war also helped the state's economy. We could no longer trade with Britain. So you saw rudimentary, at best, manufacturing kind of crop up around this time. To help pay the war, we also saw a distilled spirits tax be levied, and that tax stayed in effect until 1817, when it was repealed, and it was brought back during the Civil War in 1862. The War of 1812 had a lasting effect on Kentucky. One of the permanent changes was that the Shawnee never again challenged white control of the state. From the state's beginning, from the earliest settlements, the Shawnee had raided into Ohio. I wrote about Spencer Record for the paper, and you may have read that. If not, we have his story here. He came down the Ohio on a flatboat to settle at Limestone, which is what we call Maysville today. And he wrote about his experience with Simon Kenton chasing the Native Americans back over the river. He wrote about them coming over and taking horses and livestock, and then Simon Kenton would get a group of men together and go back to reclaim what was taken. And he wrote extensively about such things. Also, for Kentucky, a number of future leaders served in this war. Counting Isaac Shelby from his second term on, there were 6 consecutive governors who fought in the War of 1812. Later on, we also picked up 2 more governors, Charles Wickliffe and John J. Crittenden, who served as aides-de-camps during the war. 22 of Kentucky's 120 counties are named for men who fought in this war. And that includes 9 that were named after men who were killed at the River Raisin. At the time of the war, we had 18 states in the United States. They were, and I believe that this list, when I did the list, I did it in order of entry into the Union. Don't quote me on that, but I believe I did. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and Louisiana. Louisiana was admitted to the Union in April, and the war started in June. So it was a new state in the Union. As I mentioned earlier, war hawks were also a part of the reason we got into war. And probably one of Kentucky's most famous war hawks was Henry Clay. He demanded that the British revoke their decrees that involved impressment of sailors and impeding trade. And he saw that as, they had really, by enforcing those, I guess I want to say, by enforcing those decrees, Britain had in fact declared a de facto war on the United States. He did realize the dangers of fighting Great Britain, who at the time was one of, if not the most powerful country in the world. But he saw it as the only realistic alternative to the humiliating submission to the British attacks on American shipping. So he led the successful effort in the House to declare war against Britain. Madison signed this declaration of war on the 18th of June. So he asked for war on the 1st and he signed it on the 18th. The governor of Kentucky at the time was Charles Scott. He was also the 4th governor of Kentucky. Scott died in October of 1813. So he died before the war was over. His term ended in 1812, just as we were on the cusp of entering into fighting in this area in Ohio and Indiana and Canada. and Isaac Shelby replaced him. Shelby had already served one term. In September of 1811, William Henry Harrison, who was then the governor of the Indiana Territory, visited Kentucky, and he directed Colonel Samuel Wells to recruit Kentuckians for a new federal regiment that was being formed by the Secretary of War. Harrison did not go through Scott to get permission to recruit in Kentucky. And many Kentuckians just saw this as a slight to our governor. However, Scott did not see it that way and actually became, he made no issue of it, and he actually became one of Harrison's staunchest supporters. So in November of that year, we're in 1811, so a couple of months after recruiting began, a messenger brought news to Kentucky of the former Kentucky Attorney General Joseph Hamilton Davis's death at the Battle of Tippecanoe. And his death really kind of amplified Kentuckians' feelings in favor of war. So, anticipating a federal call for volunteers, Scott published messages in the state's newspapers in February and in April of 1812, trying to whip up support and increase recruits for the war effort. By the end of July of 1812, the state had met its quota of 5,500 volunteers. On August the 12th, 1812, Scott was in his last day of office. He appointed Harrison Brevet Major General over the Kentucky militia. The appointment was made on advice from the incoming governor, Isaac Shelby, and from Henry Clay. This is going to kind of lead to a little hard feelings, I guess we'll say, later on. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. The Kentuckians began their journey northward in August of 1812, heading toward the River Raisin, or the town of French Town. Troops further south of us congregated in Georgetown and then made their trip to visit the governor before they departed for the Newport barracks. Our men joined them at the Newport barracks, and then they crossed the Ohio together. So that's going to lead us to who were the players in this war. There were three major generals who fought in this area. And by this area, I am referring to Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Canada. Henry Proctor was the Brigadier General of the British forces. He was around stationed at Detroit, actually Fort Malden, Canada, which was not far from there. So he marched from Fort Malden and crossed the Detroit River and came into Michigan. And I'm going to show you his route on a map a little later. And with him, he had an army that consisted of 597, so about 600 regulars from the 41st Regiment of Foot and the Royal Newfoundland Fencibles. He also had about 800 Native Americans. The Native Americans included Shawnee, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Chippewa, Delaware, Miami, Winnebago, Creek, Sauk, and Fox tribes. This force joined up with the Essex militia, who had fallen back after they are defeated on January the 18th. And we'll talk about that skirmish a little later on, but they connected together. Shawnee leader Tecumseh was in the area, but he was not present at the Battle of Frenchtown. He left the command of the Native Americans to the Wyandot chiefs Roundhead and Walk in the Water. So Proctor, along with his men and the Native Americans, stopped about 5 miles north of the River Raisin to prepare for battle on January 21st. And we'll go into more detail about that later. We're just kind of meeting Henry Proctor right now. James Winchester, I've already mentioned him. 3 months before the war with Great Britain began in March of 1812, Winchester was commissioned a brigadier general in the United States Army. When the hostilities started in June, he was placed in command of the Army of the Northwest, which was composed of several regiments that were camped at that time near Cincinnati. However, a conflict over his command resulted in General William Henry Harrison taking charge of Winchester's forces in an expedition against Fort Wayne. By virtue of Harrison's commission from Kentucky, Winchester's was the reason for this. Okay, so the outgoing governor of Kentucky had given Harrison the appointment, and that enabled him to be in charge of the militia from Kentucky. So that starts the conflict. Winchester's seniority was confirmed in September. So it took them from June to September to get that settled out. However, he had to give up that command of the Army of the Northwest several days later, because Harrison was then commissioned a major general in the regular army. So he again outranked him. So it kind of went back and forth. On down the road, we're going to see something that happens that may be connected to this. I'm not really sure, but it could be. The next player we have is, of course, William Henry Harrison. He fought at the Battle of Tippecanoe, as well as in the War of 1812. And his exploits in both of those ventures helped propel him to become the President of the United States. He died 31 days after his inauguration in 1841 and had the shortest presidency in US history. At the time of his election, he was the oldest man elected to the office. He was 68. Since then, that has changed, but at the time, he was the oldest. Okay, on January the 18th, we're going to go back now and talk about the battle. On January the 18th, 1813, the Americans forced the retreat of the British and the Native Americans at Frenchtown. The British and their allies had already occupied Frenchtown. So forcing them out happened with a very minor skirmish. It didn't take very long. It was part of a movement of a larger plan. The plan was to just advance north and take Fort Detroit. Detroit had fallen during a siege the previous summer, which was in 1812. So reclaiming it was the ultimate goal. Following the recapture of Frenchtown, U.S. Brigadier General James Winchester and the rest of his troops, he started out with about 1,000 inexperienced regulars and volunteers, most of whom were Kentuckians. So following where he with the rest of his troops went on, and they acted without orders. So he did not have that orders. So was he trying to usurp Henry Harrison's status, I guess, as the general in charge of the troops? Or was he just thinking, oh, well, now I have an opportunity, I'm going to take it? We don't know. So he acted without orders in advancing this skirmish on the 18th, but Harrison was overall pleased with his success. But he was concerned because he had such a small force that he was afraid that if the British met up with other troops in the area, they could overpower Winchester. So he sent a messenger on to Winchester to tell him to hold the ground and to prepare for further combat. Help was on the way. He was headed there. Despite this initial success, the British and the Native Americans rallied, and they launched a surprise counterattack 4 days later on January 22nd. So we have a skirmish on the 18th. Not much happens on the 19th, 20th, or 21st. And then the 22nd, we actually get into the battle in earnest. So just to kind of give you some perspective on where things are, where the action is taking place. You see Detroit in the center of this. I'll see if I can point this without clicking there, Detroit. Down here at the bottom with the red balloon is present day Monroe, Michigan. That is where Frenchtown would have been. And you can see if you can read the green words there, the River Raisin National Battlefield Park. Okay. So that would have been where the battle actually occurred. And this map is going to show you the route that the Kentuckians took. Down at the very bottom, you see where the dotted line is the actual route. Down at the very bottom is Georgetown, which is where the starting point would have been. They moved on up here to Newport, on into Lebanon, Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, St. Mary's, Ohio, then into Fort Wayne. And then they come into Toledo and cross over into the Michigan Territory along the Detroit River there. And then, so that's the Americans' route to the battle area. This is the route that Proctor and his men would have taken. They're coming from Fort Malden, which is in the red box at the top of the highest red box on the right of the screen. And then they crossed the Detroit River and came down into Monroe. It's kind of, my line is off a little bit, but it's not off a whole lot, so I didn't try to fix it, but it's a good approximation. When Proctor heard that the Americans had recaptured the fort at Frenchtown on the 18th, he marched his troops from Fort Malden and crossed the, as I said, the Detroit River from Upper Canada. Proctor surprised the American forces before sunrise on January 22nd. A Canadian volunteer named John Richardson, who marched with the 41st Regiment of Foot, later wrote about that day, and he said, these are his words exactly. On the 22nd, before daybreak, came within sight of the enemy. Such was their security and negligence that our line was actually half formed within musket shot of their defenses before they were even aware of our presence. There were 4 companies of infantry on the American side, consisting of green recruits, mostly green, and they were caught out in the open. These troops faced heavy musket volleys to the front while being under direct fire from cannon as well. The American regulars stood their ground for only 20 minutes before they broke and ran. General Winchester was asleep at the time, and he was awakened by artillery fire and rushed to the battlefield. He ordered 240 men from the 1st Kentucky Rifle Regiment to reinforce the regulars. They could not even reach the regulars. They were under fire from 3 sides by that time, and the Americans then fell into a headlong retreat toward Ohio. They tried 3 times to rally and were eventually completely surrounded on a narrow road. By this time, there were 400 Americans who had been on the field. Almost 220 had been killed. Many were shot, tomahawked, and scalped during this withdrawal. 147 men, including Winchester, were captured by Indians and Canadian militia. Chief Roundhead, stripped Winchester of his uniform before he turned him over to the British. And that led to the legend, and you maybe have heard this, that Winchester was captured in his nightshirt. Okay. The remaining Americans were scattered and they were in no position to fight. There was at least one colonel shot dead and scalped. Dozens had laid down their weapons to surrender, only to be tommyhawked. There were men from other units that tried to flee, and most were run down and killed. A few enterprising men did escape by removing their shoes. They ran in their sock feet, and that looked more like moccasins in the snow. So the British and their allies didn't pursue those footprints, and these men were able to escape that way. The 1st and the 5th Kentucky Rifle Regiments and the 1st Volunteers, which is the 1st Volunteers is where Pendleton Countyans were. They continued to hold out in Frenchtown. They lost 5 and 40 were wounded. By lost, I mean killed, dead, 40 wounded. They had succeeded in taking a heavy toll on the British artillery. Their marksmen had killed or wounded all but one member of the gun crews manning the 3 cannon that the British troops had, and they had killed or wounded 13 of the 16-man howitzer crew. They had also brought down many infantries, but they started to run out of ammunition. They had repulsed 3 British assaults, so they were running low. Proctor then demanded that Winchester, who was his prisoner, by the way, order his remaining men to surrender. And he threatened that all would be killed or Frenchtown would be burned. I'm sorry. Proctor considered on an unconditional surrender, but Winchester had made a counter proposal that was shot down. I mean, he was negotiating from a position of weakness. He was a prisoner himself. So the British go in to deliver the message under a white flag, calling for the unconditional surrender. Kentucky riflemen thought it was a truce. So when they found out it wasn't, they refused to surrender and decided to fight to the death rather than to trust the Native Americans. They continued then fighting for another 3 hours. At this point, a Major Madison began to negotiate with Proctor on the surrender, and he was able to get a promise from Proctor that the men who surrendered would be protected as prisoners of war. So he then issued a formal declaration of surrender. So immediately after hearing that they were going to be surrendered, some of the Kentuckians argued with their officers that they would rather die on the field than surrender because they believed that their captors would kill them anyway. But the fighting did stop and they did surrender. During this second battle, 397 Americans were killed and 547 taken prisoner. Proctor then decides on a hasty retreat. He is afraid that Harrison was sending more troops. So he wanted to get out of the way. So he marched all the uninjured prisoners north across the frozen Detroit River to Fort Malden. And the wounded prisoners who were unable to walk were left behind at Frenchtown. So this was on the 22nd. The next morning on the 23rd, the Native Americans who were also left behind by Proctor began robbing the injured Americans in Frenchtown. They also set fire to the buildings that housed the wounded. Any prisoners who escaped from the burning buildings were killed, and the rest died in the flames. Then the Potawatomi had taken some of the prisoners and had headed north to Detroit with them prior to this. but if you couldn't keep up, they killed you. According to an account of a survivor of this march, the road was for miles strewed with the mangled bodies. Estimates of the numbers of wounded and killed by the Indians, who the killed and wounded left behind, okay, that were in the burning building, ranged from 30 to 100, depending on who you talk to. This is probably, the numbers probably were reflective of Proctor's bounty that he offered to Native Americans for the scalps of American soldiers. The slaughter of the American wounded on January 23rd became known as the River Raisin Massacre. The events of the 18th through the 23rd were the deadliest single battle during the War of 1812. And of course, Kentuckians bore the brunt of that. Americans were so horrified by just the massacre that they really didn't, it overshadowed the battle. They really didn't think much about it. It was the massacre that really, I guess you could say, set them off. And the rallying cry then became, "Remember the Raisin." And this led many more Kentuckians to sign up for the war. Now, at this point, we are going to look at the Pendleton County soldiers who served during this conflict. On this slide, I have all of the officers, and then I've started with some of the enlisted men. I have 2 more slides of enlisted men, and we're going to talk about some of these men in a little more depth than others. Michael Glaves was the captain of this particular, of the Pendleton County Regiment. They were attached to James Scott, as I mentioned earlier. Glaves was wounded, and any man who has a little star behind his name like Glaves does was wounded. Okay, that's my signal there for that. We are going to talk about him a little more in depth on the next slide. He was from the Collinsville area. Glaves, along with a few other men on this paper, on this slide paper, I've got a paper in my hand. On this slide, fought in what we knew as the Cornstalk Militia. Okay, so Glaves had been fighting in the Kentucky militia since about 1790. Lieutenant Thomas Coleman was also in the Cornstalk Militia. He died en route to the battle. He died in December 23rd, 1812. Don't know why. He was replaced, his position as lieutenant was replaced by James King, who is the next name. We have Sergeant William Bryan, Sergeant David Craig, Sergeant John Dawson, and I'm going to talk a little bit about him when I finish reading through the names. We also have Sergeant Martin Fugate. Martin Fugate was from Collinsville. Corporal John Goodwin. Goodwin was a substitute for John Lawrence. And the little upside down V behind his name and Dawson and some of the others means that they were taken POW on that day, on the 22nd of January. I found on Goodman, he didn't file for a pension and he didn't get a land grant. So don't really know how he fared, because that's where the details would have been on fold 3. I use fold 3 for my research. And they do not have service records for the War of 1812 posted. It's just an index card that tells you the person's name and who they fought under. Let's see. I did say. So after Goodman was Thomas Bryan, also a corporal. James Henry, also a corporal. James Henry fought at the River Thames as well as here. He was from Collinsville as well. He was also in the Cornstalk Militia. Corporal Daniel McLean, Corporal John Walker, Albert Ammerman. Albert Ammerman was wounded in action on the 18th, so in the skirmish, and he was taken POW on the 22nd. He did draw a pension based on his injury, and we're going to talk about him a little bit later on. Thomas Baker. These are your privates, okay, that I'm getting into now, starting with Albert Ammerman. George Beard, James Browning was taken POW. He did receive a bounty land grant for his service, so he did survive the ordeal. Luke Bryan, James Burns, Abraham Childers, and Ambrose Coleman. Ambrose Coleman, for you Coleman researchers, died February 1867 in Sonoma County, California. He received a bounty land grant of 80 acres for his service, and he applied for a pension, and his wife Sarah applied for a widow's pension. She died in Ellensburg, Washington in 1884. So I thought if you're researching him, that might be some information of interest. So now we're going to go back and I'm going to talk about, I missed John Dawson there. Well, I'm going to pick John Dawson up with Reuben McCarty because their stories are intertwined. I can do that. I tapped that too quickly there, and it's going back is impossible. I mean, it can be done, but it's hard. Michael Glaves, as I already said, was the captain in the 1st Kentucky Regiment. Elijah McClanahan was the major under Colonel Scott. Elijah McClanahan was from Pendleton County. He was an early magistrate here as well, was also part of the Cornstalk Militia. This, what I'm going to read to you now is McClanahan's affidavit that he gave supporting Glaves' application for a pension due to the wounds that he received at the Battle of River Raisin. Glaves initially filed for his pension on the 16th of May in 1820. So this is how it reads. I, Elijah McClanahan, late major of the 1st Regiment of the Detached Militia, commanded by Colonel John Scott, do certify that on the 22nd of January, 1813, at the Battle of River Raisin, Michael Glaves, a captain in my battalion of the said 1st Regiment, received his wounds, one in his hand and one in his jaw, which wounds has much disabled him. Also in his pension records, Glaves' personal physician, who was Jeremiah Monroe, a Falmouth physician, and also the surgeon for this company, gave a little more detail. He said that he received 2 wounds, one in his left hand by a ball passing through the metacarpal bones. And the other wound was from a gunshot in the upper jaw of the ball, passing near the pterygoid, removing some of the teeth, which would have produced excruciating pain. McClanahan, back to him, he further testified that I assisted Captain Price, Captain Michael Glaves, and others in the retreat. Captain Glaves was wounded, but I succeeded in getting him off and should have saved Captain Price also, but for the weakness of my horse. The Glaves and McClanahan witnessed Captain Price being tomahawked. And in another statement that I've read by Elijah McClanahan, he had a decision to make, and Glaves was the closest to him. So he picked him up and was headed for Price when he saw him fall. Glaves, it's believed that Glaves, McClanahan, and Richard Matson, who were all ranking officers, and about 25 to 30 men, additional privates, escaped that day. So we're going to kind of look at Michael Glaves where he got shot. Here are the teeth. This is the muscle where he would have been shot through. So he lost some teeth toward the back of his mouth there. And then I promised you we would talk about Albert Ammerman a little later on as well. He was wounded on the 18th of January in the thigh by a ball, and I have in quotes, so this came from his pension record, by a ball which passed through the sartorius and pectinitis muscles, lodging against the osfemoris, which has not yet been extracted. So just to kind of show you where that is, I thought, what are those muscles? So I looked it up. Here is the sartorius, and it goes all the way up the hip here. And then I didn't mark, but H is the pectineus muscle, and it goes underneath the other. So this area of the thigh, just right about where the hip starts, would have been where he would have been shot. His pension record was dated May 15, 1820, and he did get a pension for being half disabled. So it did not completely keep him from doing manual labor. That was the catch. That you had to be fully disabled. You could not do manual labor, be able to do that. Ammerman moved to Quincy, Illinois, sometime late in the fall of 1837 because he applied to have his pension transferred to Illinois on the 25th of November, 1837. And I'm sure he did that, especially if he was counting on the income, needing the income. He did that really soon after he got there. So at this point, I'm going to go back and talk about, well, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. Let's see what's on this one. Yeah, I'm still waiting. Sorry. More men from Pendleton County. James Colvin, John and William Dance, they were both from Collinsville. Elijah and John Ellis, Robert Irwin, Thomas Ewing, James Gibson, who was both wounded and a POW. He did survive. He was not killed. He received a bounty land grant some point after the war was over. Richard Glenn, Edward Green, Jesse Green, also injured and taken POW. He also got a bounty land grant in his name after the war was over. We have Abner Hawkins, James Holmes, Jacob Huffman was taken POW. He appears on the roster of Michael Glave's company. However, I did not find a service record index card for Jacob Huffman with this regiment. I found two Jacob Huffmans, I'm assuming father and son because one was senior and the other junior, in the 16th Kentucky Regiment. And they were both listed as substitutes. The senior was substituting for a George Huffman, probably a family member, and William Porter was who the junior replaced. Their service records might have more detail. It was not uncommon for men to, maybe he fought with the 16th at other battles, and his service record for his time in the Glaves company was lost. That's a possibility. It's a possibility they're not the same person, and there never was. This Jacob Huffman is neither of these Jacob Huffmans, and there just was never a record for it, or it got lost, as I said. A lot of possibilities there, so I'm not ruling out that he's not the junior or senior. I'm throwing it in for you if you wish to, if you have a relative by that name and you wish to do further research. Also Hillary Jones, Joseph and Valentine Jump, they could have been from the part of Pendleton County that is now Grant. Remember, at this time, Grant County did not become a county until 1820. So at this time, Pendleton and Grant are Pendleton County. I know that Joseph Jump was from the Grant, Pendleton kind of close area there. And I'm not sure who Valentine is in relation to him. Samuel No, and then Thomas Love. I don't know any more about Thomas Love. He has a service record index card. I did not find a pension or a land grant, either one for him. So I don't know his final state there. On the next list, we have William Luckett, Reuben McCarty, who was a prisoner of war, John McClanahan, John McIntosh, John L. Minor. John McIntosh was a substitute for Griffin Theobald. John L. Minor does have a service record index card, but that's all I found for him. So there's no pension and no land grant. So I don't know how he fared. John Montjoy, George Norton, who was a substitute for John N. Clark, John Owens, John Pollard, and Tom Pollard. I don't know if they're connected to each other, relatives or not. Thomas Pollard filed for a pension in 1850 in Monroe County, Mississippi. He gave his address as being Paris, Monroe, Mississippi, and his age is 60 years at that time, making him born around 1790. Including his time in captivity, he reported being in the service for 7 months. He was honorably discharged in May of 1813. In his pension request dated 1853, he mentioned that he received a bounty land grant of 80 acres. He died in 1864, and the papers in his record indicate that his wife, Nancy March Pollard, may have also drawn his pension. She died in 1865. The record indicates that he was from Harrison County and that he had resided there when he enlisted. And that is possible. He does appear on GLAVES regiment, company. It's possible, that men from Harrison County are on this list. It's also possible that he came to Pendleton County at some time after the war and did live here as well. I don't know. I don't know how he wound up on a Pendleton County roster, except that maybe he just joined up with them, or maybe he lived here and moved to Harrison and just never changed his affiliation to a Harrison County regiment. So not real sure about him. William Riddle, John Sanders, William Sanders, John J. Spencer, James Stewart, Alexander Walker, Samuel Wilson, Alexander Wilson, and Philip Ammerman, who was wounded, but I have no further information on him. So that ends the roster of Pendleton Countyans who served. I wanted to throw in a little bit about the battle flag that the men used. This is the insignia on it. It was taken by Proctor, according to legend. But anyway, the British wound up with it, whether it was Proctor or not, I don't know. It was torn. And in time, Americans did go over and get to look at it. So they took some measurements, and it measured in its torn state 54 inches by 45 inches. At that time, the field or the background was considered a brownish gray in color, and they believed that it was probably white originally because several years had transpired. They had a spearhead, but no tassels. The brown eagle in the center is holding a pole, and on that pole is a red Liberty cap. In case you're wondering what the red cap had to do with anything, it is a red Liberty cap. The scroll that he's holding in his mouth says "United we stand." I know that's kind of blurry, so that might be hard to read. The ribbon was reported as being gold in color. There were 11 5-pointed stars, and they look more like suns to me, but that's between the ribbon and the eagle's head. There are 11 stars, and they believed, historians at least believe, that the torn part of the flag had additional stars, and that there could have been as many as 18, which would have covered all 18 states in the Union at that time, or maybe one less because Louisiana had just gotten into the Union when the war broke out, but they don't know because of that torn section. Of course, you see the shield of liberty on the eagle's chest, and they are in his talons. He is holding arrows. The British continued to hold this flag. It was a spoil of war. They did display it in the 1820s for a period of time. And then in 1919, Kentucky authorities somehow got hold of word that it was over there in England, and that they still had it. So there were lots of newspaper articles about it at the time, and the governor appointed a committee to try and get the flag back. The people negotiated on that committee, they went to see the flag, they tried everything. They thought they were going to get it back, and in the end, the British did not give it up because it was a spoil of war. In the end, because the flag was not preserved, it rotted to the point that it was unsavable. So all we have is the description of earlier that I read you. Okay, and that wraps up the program for today. Just want to remind you that this was not the only battle during the War of 1812 the Pendleton Countyans were in. They were at the Battle of Fort Meigs, which went from 28th of April to the 9th of May. They did not fight that entire time. A siege was involved in this. It was a very ugly battle. Not quite to the level of River Raisin, but still pretty ugly. And then the Battle of the Thames was fought in October of 1813. Pendleton County men were there as well. And some of them in this regiment, James Henry comes to mind as being one who fought at the River Thames that also was at River Raisin. But they are going to have to wait for another day. I didn't want to take too much more time. I just want to thank everyone who decided to join us today, and encourage you to subscribe to the library's YouTube channel. You can do that by clicking the subscribe. I'm having trouble talking still. The subscribe button underneath this film strip. There are other programs on our channel from the library. I have a playlist there called Local History and Genealogy, or Genealogy and Local History, or maybe just Local History. I don't remember what I named it. But anyway, it's there, and you can see all the programs that I've done and my guests have presented since we began doing online programming in 2020. So thank you again for joining us today, and I hope that you walk away from this learning something that you didn't already know. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.